Guy McPherson here on the Nature Bats Last YouTube channel. And today I have a longtime friend and supporter who, like me, has grown a little disappointed in my recent interviews. They tend to be quite short, and we don't have time to go into anything of significant depth. So we're going to call this Deep Time with Guy McPherson and Neil Shepard. With that very brief definition, I'm going to turn it over to Neil Shepard and have him explain, like I just did, why he wants to have this conversation and where he intends to go with the thing. And I suspect this will take more than one video to cover the ground that we are wanting to cover. So, Neil, take it away.
Thanks, Guy. Yeah, I've been following your work since I think the very earliest blog and vlogs that you've done, and uh, find almost everything you say to be supported by the science that you cite, um, and have followed up. I follow a number of uh, blogs, vlogs, and commentators and pundits on various climate and environmental things, as well as all the other issues that we face today in our society. And I just thought, why not try and have some discussions that go a little deeper than some of your interviews, even some of your talks, because all of what we face on the climate front takes place in this context, obviously, of time, the contemporary time in which we all live. Um, Everyone has a lot on their plate. Most people have jobs, families, issues, challenges in their lives that they have to focus on, and nothing takes place, that isn't in some ways related to a system of things. And so I try and take a systems view and a deep view of things to understand them. It's all about understanding.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so the concept of deep time to me, um, I propose that we call it Deep Time with Guy McPherson. And we, we think of deep time in many ways. Deep time means time to go deep on all the issues that pertain to um, climate change and to the way that our society has been dealing with it. Certainly, since we were born, we happen to be born almost at the same time. So last 64 years, since 1960. Deep time, as in going deep on issues. Deep time, as in um, deep, as in of potentially existential importance. These are deep issues. Deep, as in conceptually complex, requiring a more reflective and nuanced analysis. Deep, as in systems thinking. And then deep time in the obvious sense of thinking through not just the time in which we live in a human lifespan of 70, 60, 70, 80, 90 years, however long one thinks one lives. The youngest people today have a relevance based on human lifespan of 70, 80 years from now. People are just being born. And those of us who are in our 50s, people in their 30s, whatever age they happen to be that they're engaging with these kinds of issues, it requires us to think back into deep time, as in how has climate changed on this planet over the history of life on this planet, which goes back several hundred or billion years, and how has this planet changed and performed at various times in the past when there have been earth-shaking events, climate change in the history of the climate, and what might be happening that is comparable in scale to the great climate changes of the past, and where do we sit with that? So those are just some of the senses of deep. and you probably have other.
Right. And so it's pretty obvious this is going to take more than one conversation to cover in any sort of detail the topics we want to cover. And I think that's one of the reasons you proposed having these conversations, that my recent interviews have tended to be cryptic, to say the least.
Hmm. You mean your short pieces that you've done?
Yes, and when I get interviewed, for example, by political misfits, we have 3 minutes, sometimes 5 minutes to cover a topic, and that's obviously not a lot of time.
Well, this is in contrast. I mean, I encountered your vlogs and your lectures, of 10, 15 years ago in the context of major lectures on that went deeper into the history and issues around climate, the history of climate science, which, depending on when you start, begins in the 18th or 19th century, with scientists observing the very facts that that are still pertinent today, the effect of trace gases like carbon dioxide and methane in our climate. And so those kinds of lectures, I think, are still available in some form. And your website, which has a chronicle and references and links to hundreds, maybe even thousands of scientific articles and reports, which, you're just being the messenger. That's another sort of observation that I have is 95% of what I see you doing is being the messenger, referring to the work of other scientists, bringing those to our attention. Sometimes you cite journalists who are basing their articles on the new science, and so it's easy to go and find the scientific articles that they're basing their stuff on. But would I be right in 90 some percent of what you do and intend to do is bring the message, bring news that is pertinent of what scientists are discovering?
Yes, absolutely. And just the biggest mistake of my life so far has been leaving active service at the University of Arizona, because that means that I left behind a decent legal system that would have been able to support me as I've had difficulty being able to broadcast my message, go on speaking tours, get interviewed by the corporate media, and so on. So, yes, I have been trying to get this information across, largely because almost nobody else is doing so. And the people who do attempt to tell something about climate change, or even abrupt climate change, or even abrupt irreversible climate change, those folks tend to be relatively superficial in their assessment. And that's perfectly understandable. We all have lives. We all have something else that we want to do besides talk about the most horrible topic in the history of our species. So I understand why people don't want to spend a lot of time there. And for some reason, I started out spending time there and have carved out that terrain for myself, as it were. So that gets us caught up on why the hell I
No,
managed to land in this spot.
well, I think the one thing to observe is that other climate scientists whose work you point to, um, there's quite a lot of evidence that they are unable to speak as freely as they might on the consequences or ramifications of their research. In situations where they have spoken freely about what this means, what they would recommend, they often get silenced and told that they're being extremist. There's a counter trend also from people who say they're not being alarmist enough. They're not being they're not basically ready to sacrifice their career as you have, and put their academic employment at risk to come out and say, no, you're not listening. This really is serious, because they're too afraid of being censored, either for being too alarmist or not being alarmist enough. And your position, even though perhaps you wish it hadn't had occurred, your position, you're now outside of that academic science. You're not as restrained in that way. So it's a different view.
There's another reason I can say what needs to be said or what is rooted in evidence. And that's because I have very little left to lose. I,
Exactly.
I have the love of one wonderful woman. I have the support of a few friends and colleagues, and I have my integrity. That's about it, really. I'm a minimalist, not by choice, but because I have little left. And that leaves me in this maybe enviable position of being able to quote the literature in ways that other people seem to be unwilling.
And where do we stand? The public is bombarded with so many different things these days. The consumer, there'll be a number of themes. What I have in mind is that we will explore a number of different themes that would relate to people, I think, in ways that really might help them, that they may not have experienced on your channel. The information's been there, but I think what we can do is try and focus on it. And some of the big themes that may come up if this turns into a series, and if it doesn't, that's okay too. But I think there's a chronic misunderstanding of your work, your intentions, and the significance of your positions. As I said, primarily you are exercising what is called reportage or reporting of existing and new science by mostly peer-reviewed sources. And in this regard, you're mainly being a messenger and a teacher. You have your interpretation of what the ramifications of the science are, but certainly you're just being a messenger for science that's coming out from many dozens and scores of scientists whose work can be looked up. So that's the first thing. That's mainly what you're doing, and I think that gets misconstrued.
And
The
I
second,
try I try in all of my presentations, all my videos, all my writing to provide the sources that I'm relying upon. So it's just a click of a link away from me saying something and you finding who said that first or who wrote it.
absolutely, and the click of a link, and if someone wants to, the internet today, if you go and find that article and you search on some of the words from the title of that article and the author's name, you'll find very quickly if there's any other journalists or sources that have read that article and have an interpretation of how they've interpreted, if there's other scientists who cite that article. Scientific citations are a big thing. And you can go find out, do other scientists agree with Guy McPherson's interpretation of this, or do they not? Are journalists interpreting something different from this recent article than Guy McPherson is interpreting? Mostly when I've done that work, and it requires little time, I've found that the other scientists, if they are speaking candidly, they're just as concerned as you are. The journalists, unless they're a journalist who is a denier, they're citing and looking at this and saying, "Wow, this looks like something we should pay attention to." So I really don't understand why anyone would be upset with that. And the other thing is your overall message as what should we do and how should we receive this is not one of despair or of a pointlessness. Your message seems to me over the years to have very consistently been make the most of each day, make the most of your relationships, focus on those things and people that you love, places and experiences that you care about, and make those your focus. Have I missed it over following you for, since 2007 or 8? Have I missed something? Is that
No,
what else is?
no, I think you nailed it. I would go one step further and say that my message has been consistently positive with its focus on only love remains. Only love remains, a phrase that I used for the first time on my blog, October 4th, 2014.
Yes, indeed. And you've also, as I recall, we've had discussions, and we've talked about the response to the news, that negative news just in one's life. Um, the recognition that human life has a beginning, middle, and end. We're not immortal, and that death is as much a part of all living things as life is. We carry that knowledge at a rational level. Most people know that death is a part. Most people experience the death of family members, friends, during their lives, and the grieving of that. And the message of that is that, just of human life, even before one has to contemplate in a larger frame what the effect of our massively bloated society is having on the planet. One we as humans have for millennia had to figure out how to respond to, because we're cognitively capable creatures who are able to reflect forward and backward in time, able to reflect on our experience, and able to witness death in a way that very few other animals are able to. There are animals, it's obvious that higher mammals grieve for the death of their young. But humans are endowed with obviously a much deeper cognitive capability, and the world's religions and spiritual traditions and philosophies, a large part of what they've developed to deal with is this fact of life and death, the fact that life comes to an end. Buddhism, Stoicism, if you want an Eastern principle or a Western philosophy that is useful, you've adopted elements. I see elements of both of those in your outlook. And
Mm-hmm.
Buddhism and Stoicism are traditions that I find and useful as philosophical. Some people find them spiritual. I find them useful and have read a little bit about them, and I see a lot of useful and positive things in adopting those principles for confronting mortality per se, and the question of how to conduct your life. And I don't know if that sparks anything.
Yes, for many years I've been quoting the Buddha in his expression, all is impermanent. And I suspect most people think that applies to everything except their own lives. And I've since I was 11 years old and my paternal grandmother died, and I subsequently grieved for weeks, even though I didn't even know this person, right? I'd only seen her half a dozen times for a short period of time. And finally, I figured out that I wasn't grieving for her. I was grieving because I realized that I too am impermanent, that I too am going to die. I looking back, I wish I had been grieving her because I wish I had known her well enough to be grieving her, but I really didn't. And so I was grieving the understanding that I'm going to die. And that was a real bummer when I was 11 years old. I'm a lot more familiar with it now. In fact, one of the issues you sent me in an email message leading up to this conversation was the issue of why are we here? And I used to ask that of my students on the first day of class, why are you here? And every one of them would answer, because it's required. I need to take this class, and that's why I'm here. I said, okay. Okay, but what I'm
That's
talking
funny.
about is why are we here? Why are you here individually for this short time that we call a human life, a human lifespan? Why are you here? It's not just to take this class. It's not just to get a degree. What are you doing here anyway? And so it was interesting to be raising that in classrooms many years ago when other faculty members and other students really hadn't given much thought to their own mortality. Interesting.
Well, I also want at this point, this is a good segue to something else I wanted to observe that comes up, which is, uh, I have had the advantage of a college education and even some graduate education. I grew up in an academic household of both scientists and with scientists in the family and arts people in the family. And so I've had a truly privileged in every sense, but mostly in the educational sense, background. Uh, Family was not hugely wealthy or anything like that. But the point is that having met only a few scientists in my life who've had any dimension other than their scientific discipline, their particular, it's necessarily to say in academia, narrow scientific discipline. One is forced to succeed professionally in academia, you have to specialize, specialize, specialize. I don't mean just, oh, you're a physics professor, that means you're just going to do physics. You're not going to do chemistry. I mean, within physics, there's 19 different specialized areas, and you have to specialize in your area of physics. High energy physics, laser physics, whatever. It's sliced and diced into innumerable specialties. And once you specialize, your ability to make comment or the degree to which you'll be taken seriously by someone in another specialty, even within physics, is dubious. Oh, stick to your lane, stick to your knitting. You do laser physics. You don't do, astrophysics. I'm being a little bit glib here, but we live in a world of specialization, and that's just within science. How
Right.
many scientists do I meet who have read a word of what we would call philosophy? How many scientists do I meet who have read widely or deeply in literature or environmental literature? How many environmentalists have read environmental literature? That is, literature by people, Edward, Ed Abbey, John Muir, Aldo Leopold, the known canon of writers about the environment. There's a much larger canon. I've mentioned only a couple. Thoreau and Emerson, Walt Whitman. How many scientists do I meet who have actually read these people, let alone taught them in an honors class alongside range science and forestry? Am I talking to such a person right now?
Well, early on in my academic life, I realized that the whole point of an academic life was to learn more and more about less and less until you become incredibly knowledgeable. You know everything there is to know about nothing at all. That's
Right.
the
That's
academic
a
life.
much more cogent way. That's a much more cogent way of saying what I said about specialization in academia.
Right.
It's
But
too bad. It's
that's the
both.
whole story.
Yeah.
And yes, it is too bad. It's terrible actually because professors also spend time in front of a classroom. And what you're teaching young people is the road to success is littered with these ideas that only specialization matters. That's the take-home message that I get from being in many college classrooms is that the students are hearing that only this matters. I used to tell my students the first day of class, every time I taught, that this is not the most important thing in your life. My class is not the most important thing in your life. Neither is anybody else's class for that matter. You got a lot going on, right?
Yeah.
You got a lot going on. You're falling in love seriously, perhaps for the first time. You're in the process of getting married, maybe having kids. All your friends are doing the same thing. This is an enormous load. Your grandmothers are going to die right before the first test and right before the second test, and then your grandfather's going to, you know, there's a lot going on in your life. This class is not the most important thing going on in your life. It was a burden lifted off the students.
That's really great. Well, and to be able, I mean, the number of scientists who have read even a single dialogue by Plato or have read at all in philosophy and tried to relate that to what they're doing. And so when I listen to you talk about this, and I, with great delight, realized that you're someone who's widely read and actually brought that into your teaching, which, by the way, is not welcomed in most universities. They sometimes talk in universities, oh, we really are a place that encourages interdisciplinary teaching and communication. Very few academic institutions actually do encourage that or facilitate it. Some actively punish it. So I find it so valuable that you brought that to your students and that you are bringing that to all that you have to share on these difficult topics.
Well, it's interesting. I'd only recently received my PhD, my Doctor of Philosophy degree. And then I got to campus and I realized I had some time on my hands. When I first showed up, I didn't have to teach a course the first semester. So suddenly I realized I have a doctorate degree in philosophy and I don't really know what that means. I've never read any philosophy. In the process of getting 2 graduate degrees, I'd never read a single piece of philosophy. Maybe I should catch up. And so that's what I spent the first few years on campus doing, is reading everything I could find about philosophy,
Wow.
including going to the roots, you know, the Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, the people who were actually forming the foundation for philosophy. And and so little is left of their work, but there's a lot of reference to their work by other people.
Well, and the actual substance of their lessons. I mean, Socrates. I mean, as presented in Plato. I mean, the what should we do according to Socrates? What are the most important things? What they are, and I'll summarize them from my take, is truth. First of all, the pursuit of truth, trying to understand what is the real case. Beauty, trying to understand what is beauty, what makes something beautiful, and of course, when you find truth, often one feels that it is beautiful, even if it isn't, even if it is a difficult truth. Virtue, the third thing, how to lead a virtuous life. What would that mean? Uh, and fourthly, the public good, the civic good. We should do all those first 3 things. If we do those, we are also needing to think about the public good. Those 4. If you just were to read Plato or read Plato and Aristotle, but read Plato and look at Socrates' teachings within Plato. Of course, Socrates was Plato's teacher and Plato was Aristotle's teacher. So with those 3, you are really getting at what have been taken at the foundations of Western thought. Indeed, much of it, much of Christianity can be said to have borrowed from those 3.
Right.
So
And Aristotle taught Alexander the Great.
there you go. And
So
so just those 4 concepts, truth, beauty, virtue, and the public good. Are these worth thinking about today? Are these values? If you think about these things and you delve into them, can you be accused of being a nihilist or being negative or being a doomer? I just don't think those those are the first words that would come to mind if one is mindful of truth, beauty, virtue, and the public good.
right. These are among the most important things any of us could be focusing on, could be learning, could be applying. How do we how do we implement these concepts to the good of all, including ourselves? These are the
Exactly.
important questions. These are the important questions that I never hear in a college classroom.
Strange. Because everyone who gets a PhD graduates with some initials that mean Doctor of Philosophy. So, but currently philosophy is a department. And one of my most dismaying things was actually trying to take courses in philosophy in the philosophy department and finding that they were completely uninterested in questions. If I raised something that looked like literature, they said, well, that's literature. You'll have to go to the English department or the literature department to explore that. And if you raised something about physics or the actual quantum physics or the most interesting questions in physics actually border on philosophy, meaning existence, etc. They would quickly dismiss you from the philosophy department and say, maybe you should major in physics or the history of science. Maybe that's your major. You should do the history of science, Neil. I mean, and in the and then in any of these departments, if you raise something that looks like politics, so I just finished telling you that my impression, and you agreed that the four things in Plato are virtue, truth, beauty, virtue, and the public good. So if you're in a philosophy class in today's philosophy department, and you raise the question of the public good, well, Plato and Aristotle, they're both talking about the public good.
Mm-hmm.
Shall we delve into that? You'll very quickly get into waters where they say, well, maybe you should, Guy, you should, maybe what you're interested in political science. You should go, you're talking about politics, go to the political science department. But I assure you, if you go to the political science department and say, well, I've been reading Plato and he talks a lot about the public good, and I think we should have a discussion about the public good today, they'll say, well, you belong in the philosophy department. You say, I've just been there.
They send me to you.
They sent me here. And then in literature, if you do literary theory, some of the literature departments will quickly say, you want to do political theory, so you should go to the political science department. I mean, you go around and around between, let me see, how many departments have I named? Physics, philosophy, literature, political science, history of science. Well, guess what? Those are 5 of the departments in which I ended up taking 3 or 4 courses. And by the time I was a senior, physics and science, I had not taken more than 5 or 6 courses in any one department. And so I was told that I had no major. Fortunately, the university that I went to, they had was a little 1-page section that said you can create a special major and you just have to get 2 faculty members to agree to it. And all you had to do, and I was a senior by this, I was not going to graduate in any department because most departments require 12 or 14 credits in that department, and you're one of the majors. And so I found this little loophole. I mean, it was a legit thing. It said a special major, and you had to put together a 2-page précis where you listed all the courses you've taken and put an asterisk beside the 12. You had to have at least 12 that constitute your major. So I listed all the courses that I took, and I put an asterisk besides 12 that I thought hung together, and then it said you have to write a 1-page précis of why your course of study, as indicated by those courses with an asterisk, constitutes a coherent course of study. As you can, I mean, that's the easy part. Of course it's coherent. The fact that these are in 5 or 6 different departments might make it to an academic specialized mind look incoherent, but it all hangs together to me. Right. I wrote the précis. I took it to 2 professors who I knew. I was not their devoted student. Since I was not in any of the majors, there was no way they were invested in me, except in this sense. I'm sure they didn't want me coming back the following year as a 5th-year student who had failed to graduate in a major. There is the motivation that they wanted to, be rid of me. And the best way to be rid of me was to sign that précis and say, we think this hangs together. Graduate this guy. So getting a real education can be a challenge in academia today, and getting an interdisciplinary education is a challenge. So.
And yet you managed.
I think I did, but by the standards of the majors, this is just at college level. Don't get me started on graduate school. Um, I had failed. I did not have, I had to create a special major. So to close on this topic, I think that you bring a philosophical and literary awareness. Literature is about stories, it's about meaning, it's about what we value, what we find compelling. It's about our trials and struggles. Literature is about epic heroes. It's about human life. And philosophy, as we've said, it's about many things, but let's just take the four Platonic topics that I mentioned. You bring an awareness as a scientist of those things to the discussion of the challenges of climate change and how we respond. And that's really valuable. That's part of why I'm here and what I take from your work. And I have even, I think, on one occasion said, if you're looking for how academia names things, the American philosophic and literary tradition that commented on the environment and on built industrial modern civilization to the extent that it was. Two of the big thinkers of that, the big writers, Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, they're part of, as is Whitman, the poet, they are part of an American movement. It's not a movement. It was a manifestation in literature and philosophy, arts and letters, as they say, in the 19th century that we call transcendentalism. Mm-hmm. And in the 20th century, some of the writers that I would put in what I call, and it's not just me, there's an academic, historians of art and literature call neo-transcendentalists, the modern environmental writers, Ed Abbey, Wendell Berry, and others, are in a tradition reading Thoreau, Emerson, and others, understanding what we are doing here on this continent, on Turtle Island, what we have built, what we have succeeded in and failed in, and how we have stewarded the environment, if that word can even be used. You're part of that tradition. So I have told you that I consider you part of the neo-transcendentalist tradition. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I appreciate that very much, obviously. Relatively late in life, post-undergrad, post-college, postgraduate school, postdoc. So when I was in my late 20s and early 30s, I read a lot of this information. That tells me that if I could do this with my minimal education in philosophy, if I could do this, then anybody could do this. And I have benefited greatly from an understanding of philosophy that began with my recognition that I didn't know anything about the things I thought I should know about, and then actually tracking them down and trying to read them. I think that's a pretty good place to wrap this up, this episode, and start thinking about the next episode of Deep Time with Guy McPherson and Neil Shepard.
Sounds good. I am looking forward to that, and we will no doubt find interesting topics.
All right. Looking forward to it. Thank you very much.